Well, good afternoon, everybody. I can see our panelists and I can see our attendees adding up here, so I can still see that people are joining us. I'll just wait a minute or two to see if there's anybody else who'll join us. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to the 2021 CGU online series of research presentations that will run through both June and July on most Tuesdays and some Thursdays this summer. Our session today, themed Lakes and Streams, is the very first session kicking off the summer series. We're delighted to have speakers contributing to today's session from across the country. My name is April James. I'm one of the three conveners for today's session, along with Andrew Ierson from the University of Saskatchewan and Jason Leach from Natural Resources Canada. I'm joining in today in today's session from Nipissing University in North Bay, Ontario, which sits on the territory of Nipissing First Nation, the territory of the Anishinaabe, within lands protected by the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We are grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands with all our relations. And I offer this land acknowledgement to have us pause and reflect on our Pan-Canadian session today, a chance for us to individually acknowledge the history and Indigenous peoples of our respective regions and the ongoing work of reconciliation. So before we start today with our speakers, I want to mention that at the end of this session, we will run a promotional video for next year's annual CGU meeting with the theme of Science Serving Society. It's going to be held in Saskatoon, and it'll be, of course, the first in-person meeting in several years' time, right, since 2019. So this will be exciting to attend, and we hope to see you there. The YouTube video will be available on the CGU website. We'll also add it here to the chat. If there's any issues related to sound or watching the video, you can check it out there as well after the session. So I'm going to wait a few minutes. We've got, those are my opening comments to our session. We've got 6 speakers with us today. We're going to start in a few minutes with the first speaker. So I'll pause here just so that we're on time and starting with the first speaker at 1:35 as planned. So our first speaker in this session comes to us from the University of Toronto, Alexis Robinson, who will be presenting on refining medium-sized lakes to improve lake ice simulations in Canada. Alexis, please feel free to share your screen.
Okay.
And the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, so Since I've already been introduced, my name's Alexis. I'm from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And what I'll be presenting today is some work that I'm currently working on for my PhD. So I'm looking at how to refine the representation of medium-sized lakes to improve lake ice simulations in Canada. So in terms of global lake abundance, it's highest for the latitudes between 45 and 75 degrees north, with most of those lakes, freshwater lakes, dominated by medium to large size lakes. So medium lakes being lakes considered between 1 kilometer squared to 100 kilometers squared, and large lakes anything over 100 kilometers squared. So some recent research on Northern Hemisphere lakes has projected an exponential increase in a number of these lakes transitioning from annual to intermittent winter ice cover with climate warming. And in addition, many of these lakes also do experience some ice cover throughout the year, even at the lower latitudes. In terms of the warming, northern latitudes are warming at a more rapid rate, about 2 times the global mean compared to the southern latitudes, and then the Arctic latitudes are around 3 times the global mean. So in terms of modeling, lake ice models can be used to study current and projected changes in ice-covered lakes under a changing climate. The model I'll be using is the Canadian Lake Ice Model, which is a well-tested one-dimensional thermodynamic freshwater ice cover model that's been successfully used for both the Arctic and the subarctic ice cover. And recent work, which we've just published from Haliburton, Ontario, has shown that adjusting the albedo parameterization within CLIMO results in a better representation of temperate region lakes. And we've coined this model CLIMO temperate. So I'll be discussing that in a little bit more detail. In terms of the objectives for this particular study, it's just preliminary results that are going to be comparing simulated breakup and freeze up dates for selected medium-sized lakes, so that range between 1 to 100 square kilometers across Canada. And we're going to be looking to confirm where the separation between using CLIMO and CLIMO temperate occurs, using vegetation as a climate proxy, as well as looking at how to develop a lake adjustment factor to account for breakup delay on the medium to large lakes. And this will hopefully improve the ability to model or represent both the medium and large lakes that we have. So this is just the study area in terms of the lakes that we've got access to. So I'm using a couple of databases, and we have access to about, with records, 175 lakes. I've split them up between small lakes, so anything under 1 square kilometer, to medium and large lakes. And then I've just overlaid them on the biogeoclimatic zones, just the level 1 product. So you can just see kind of roughly where a lot of them are. We do have quite a few in the eastern temperate section, but then a lot are also in the boreal forest and woodland. And then some are we have them around sort of that transition zone between them. In terms of the medium lakes of interest that I'm actually pulling out to look at in terms of looking at in more detail to how to figure out where that actual transition happens. These are the medium lakes of interest. There's about 33 of them that I'm going to be looking at in more detail. And then some of them are in the eastern cool temperate, and then some are in the boreal forest area, but most are around that sort of transition area. So between 46 and 55 degrees latitude north. And then the 4 lakes I'm going to concentrate on for today are, I'm just going to be showing some results from the high Arctic that we have to show you that the model does work. So Resolute Lake, and then 2 other lakes other than where our study site was in Haliburton Forest, so Lake of Bays and Gull Lake, which are not too far from Haliburton, but they're in the temperate region. And then a lake sort of around this transition area in Quebec, so Lac Blouin. So in terms of CLIMO and CLIMO temperate, this is just a schematic of the model that we use. So you have your inputs, which are point data from the weather stations. So climate data, snow depth and density, latitude, and mixing the climate data that we're putting in is temperature, wind speed, cloud data, and relative humidity, as well as the snow depth. And then, sorry about that. And then in terms of the albedo itself, so the top part of the model here where you've got the modeled layer, this is for the snow albedo and then the ice albedo. And so what we were looking at in Halliburton was we were taking field measurements of both of these factors and looking at what they look like over the winter season and then the early part of the melt season. So in terms of the melt season, we were only on the lake from sort of mid-March to early April, depending on the season. Some seasons we had to come off earlier, and that's just because the ice itself is getting too thin and they don't want us on the ice. But in terms of the albedo, so both snow albedo was higher in the temperate regions. So we were measuring around a mean of 0.85 over the course of our winter study period, which is higher than the Arctic snow albedo, which was 0.75. And this was in part due to a lot of consistently getting a lot of fresh snowfalls, usually just before we went out to measure as well. And then the ice albedo, we were measuring at around 0.75 for that winter season. And then as you get into the melt season, the snow albedo does drop, but not as far as what was in the Arctic. So the Arctic is 0.65, and then that temperate region was at 0.75. In terms of the validation results from that particular study, this is just a graph of showing you what we were looking at. So the red is the Climo, just the Arctic version that we have. And then the blue line is our Climo temperate. So you can see Climo itself was under predicting ice off. So it was around 26 to 22 days. So 22 days for the shallow water ice profiler and 26 days for the SWIP for both Clear Lake and McDonald Lake. But when we adjusted for both snow and ice albedo, we were within 2 to 3 days of ice off. So the inputs that I'm using, this is just a representation and a little bit more detail for the model that I'm looking for what I'm going to be doing today. So you've got air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, cloud cover, and snow accumulation. All of that data is from Environment Canada. And then we're running some model simulations. So for the temperate region, our snow accumulation is going to be at 50%, and that's based on the work that we did in Halliburton. So of the 4 years of work, the mean snow cover was around 50%. For the Arctic, we're using end of year snow survey data, which was around 50% for Resolute Lake. And then we also do the varying snow density. So snow density we get as well from the Canadian Snow CD. However, we know from studies, both temperate for the subarctic and Arctic, it's around 20% greater than what's measured on land. And from our field work, we were for the temperate region was around 30% greater. So those are also adjusted within the model. And then for our validation data, I'm using the lakes within the Canadian Ice Database, as well as supplementing it with some additional lakes that are in the National Snow and Ice Data Center database. All right, so this is for Resolute Lake. So this is just some work that we were doing previously. So Resolute Lake is considered a medium-sized lake, but on the small end, it's around 1.2 square kilometers with a mixing depth of 10 meters. In terms of the ice off, it was around we got 8 days. The record length is about from 1968 to 1994. There are dates missing in between though. And then our index of agreement, which is just how the model fits, is around 0.75 for ice off. And then ice on was 6 days, and then an index of agreement of 0.65. So the results for Climo Temperate, which is looking at our 2 lakes, so Lake of Bays, which I have highlighted here, and that's this one just a little bit further north from Gull Lake. It's a much bigger lake. Lake size is around 70 kilometers. We used a mixing depth of 30. And then for ice off, which is all the records that we have, is within 6 days. This record length is much longer. It goes from 1953 up to 2004. Index of agreement was 0.84. Unfortunately, they don't record ice on, so I don't have that information. However, for Gull Lake, which is around 2 kilometers squared, we got mean absolute error 4 days and an index of agreement of 0.8 for ice off, and then for ice on was within 5 days and an index of agreement of 0.63. So fairly decent results for both of those lakes in terms of ice off. So in terms of those lakes looking for separation, I did run the model for both Climo and Climo-Temperate using the different snow densities and the snow redistribution values. So in terms of lac Léman under Climo, so this will be the Arctic model, this lake size is around 14 square kilometers, so sort of in between. And it's at index of agreement of 0.6 for ice off, and then 0.59 for ice on. For the second model, Climo-Temperate, the index of agreement improved a little bit to 0.63, and then ice off was ice on was the same at 0.59. And you can see here, I've just got some lake depths that you can see. So in terms of ice thickness, the blue line is Climo-Temperate, and it's actually closer. So I do have some maximum ice thickness measurements. I don't have a date, but the max ice thickness for 1980 and 1981 is around 100 centimeters. And you can see here, it's around 80 and 90 centimeters for those 2 years, whereas for the Arctic, it's still a little under-predicted there. So in terms of what I'm showing, so the preliminary simulations show that Climo-Temperate performs well for medium-sized lakes in those temperate regions as well as the high Arctic. The results have led to further refining for the identification of which model we need to use. And I'll be using sort of the vegetation as a proxy for climate, because it's mapped out and it's in good detail, especially the biogeoclimatic identification from the from NRCan, which does also account for climate within that model. And then for additional validation, because we do want to make sure that the Climo-Temperate is good for all areas, we're doing some more field work in Halliburton as well. So, and I just want to thank all the field help and some of the funding. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Alexis. My apologies, I forgot to mention to everyone that we have time for questions here briefly. All participants can submit questions using the chat. So if you have any questions, you can quickly type those in. But Alexis, while we're waiting maybe for any questions, I'll ask a question. I'm not as familiar with modeling lake processes, but I wondered about, oh, we do have a question. I was wondering about uncertainties, dealing with uncertainties in model processes and parameters, and if there's a comparable type of exploration of the parameter space. Is that relevant to use of Climo?
Yeah, so we do a lot of the uncertainty stuff. So what we try to do is look at the simulated versus the observed for the results, but also looking at the weather data as well. Luckily, a lot of the lakes we're using for this, they're actually right beside weather stations. But obviously, as you get further away from a weather station, you get more uncertainty with the weather data, especially if it's much further away. So we do try to address that within the models themselves by looking at sort of those simulated values.
Okay, let me ask you a quick second question from one of our participants then. They say, great talk. Could you comment on the assumptions of using a 1D model? What key processes might be missing?
So one of the things that definitely, so a one-dimensional model assumes that breakup and freeze up happen at the same time throughout the lake. So when you make that assumption, you're assuming that it's happening simultaneously, and that doesn't happen. So we do make that assumption. What we're using is obviously for some of our sites, we're looking at cameras all over the lake to make sure to see how that's happening. But some of the things that aren't incorporated, for example, would be wave action and wind action in terms of breakup and for freeze up, and freeze up especially definitely, like, it doesn't account for any freeze up. So we might have freeze up and then wind action breaking apart the ice itself before it completely freezes. So
Great.
There are these things to remember with a one-dimensional model, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexis. Okay, we're going to move on to our second speaker, Danielle Hudson from Natural Resources Canada. And Danielle, when you're ready, please feel free to share your screen, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so today I'll be talking about lake stream interactions within the Turkey Lakes watershed and implications of this for watershed response to forest change. So as we know, and as April highlighted, or Alexis highlighted for us, lakes are a significant component of the forest water network in our subboreal and boreal forests. And these lakes are often very small in size and have shallow depths, but they are abundant and often connected by streams. So, however, researchers tend to consider lakes and streams as separate and distinct components of this system, and this can miss key interactions that might have implications for downstream water quantity, quality, and aquatic habitat. So with this study, we wanted to take sort of a network scale perspective and consider lakes, streams, and forests as a linked system. So some researchers have done this, and the work that has been done has largely focused in mountainous or arid environments, or it has been a modeling focused study. And these findings have concluded that lake stream interactions are often controlled by hydroclimatic factors and the network structure. With our work today, we wanted to look at long-term field data and investigate these lake stream interactions at the annual and rain event scale for a forested catchment just north of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. This catchment is about 10.4 kilometers squared, and it's a long-term catchment study that began in 1980. So we have a significant data set. As I said, this is a forested catchment, largely sugar maple and birch, and then some conifers as well. And as you can see in the watershed map here, there's 4 significant lakes within the catchment, and the blue triangles mark Water Survey of Canada hydrometric stations, and that's the data we used for this analysis. The water in this catchment flows from the headwaters up at Batchewana, at the top of Batchewana Mountain here. It flows down through the catchment out into Batchewana River and eventually Lake Superior. These 4 lakes vary in size, and they vary in the distance from the lake outflow to the hydrometric station. So when we talk about lake influence, we're largely looking at that distance and also the relative area of the lake versus the catchment area. So I'll dive into it. So today we won't really be talking about the annual scale analysis for the sake of time, but I wanted to give a bit of an overview. So we used 26 years of data here, and we used daily stream flow, and we calculated 6 stream flow metrics. They're plotted up here, but generally we didn't see much clear lake influence at the annual scale because of the strong confounding influence of catchment area. But we did find that catchments located closer to the lake outflows were potentially less flashy than other catchments further downstream from the lake. So that's sort of our annual scale. And then that leads into our sub-daily analysis, where we will talk about this a bit more. So we used hourly stream flow data from 1997 to 2015, and we identified stream flow events that occurred in response to rainfall only. So we focused on the June to September period. Once we defined our streamflow events, we ended up analyzing between 233 and 245 events, depending on the station. And we calculated 2 metrics for comparing these events, peak flow response and rise rate. We started off by plotting our event hydrographs, and we started to see clear differences in these hydrographs depending on the event magnitude and the antecedent flow. So I've pulled a few examples to look at today. So for these 2 events, A and B, both occurred under low antecedent flow conditions, and the catchments were relatively dry. And in event A, 45 millimeters of rain occurred, and in event B, 9 millimeters. So with event A, when the catchment was dry and a high precipitation event occurred, you can see site 13, 9 had the greatest increase, and a slight increase down here at 5. But it's interesting to note that 13 and 9 were our sites with sort of the least direct lake influence. And then our sites that had more lake influence had very little response at all, such as 6 and 7. Then when we look at event B, where we had low precipitation and dry conditions, there was very little streamflow response, and that can be expected. So that's just highlighting sort of the role that the different precipitation amounts play. And then when we look at these 2 events, C and D, both had about 58 millimeters of rain occur. But in event C, the conditions or the catchment was wetter. So there was antecedent flow, and this occurred in early June or mid-June. And in event D, there was no antecedent flow and the catchment was drier. So the important thing to think about with these antecedent flow conditions is that this is sort of representative of the storage availability in the catchment. And we can think about when there is less storage available, such as when a high rain event occurs and the conditions are wetter beforehand. We see all of the sites have somewhat of a streamflow response, but interestingly, sites 13, 9, and 5 have this sort of double peak occurring. And these again were our sites that were less directly influenced by the lake. And then we have sites such as 6 and 7, which are located very close to lake outflows, and they have quite a more moderate streamflow increase, and the peaks are delayed. Then we have sites such as 8 and 12, which are kind of in the middle. And 12 is a bit of an anomaly, and I'll explain a bit more. But when we look at in event D, where we had no antecedent flow, that same rain event of 58 millimeters, or the same amount, had very little increase in streamflow at any site, but 13 and 9 still had a slight increase here. Now, as I mentioned, 12 is a bit of an anomaly because this site is located at a lake outflow, but when the conditions are wetter and there's less storage capacity in the catchment, 12 responds a lot like sites that are further downstream from the lake. But then when the catchment is dry and there's more storage available, 12 responds like the other lake sites. And like I said, this is sort of intuitive, but it's interesting to see. And I think this threshold response that's occurring at 12 likely exists for the other catchments as well. But 12 is a smaller catchment with a lot of exposed bedrock, and it has the smallest lake. So we're really seeing that transition between when the lake can moderate flows and when it cannot. So from the hydrographs and our previous understanding of the literature, we suspected that event precipitation and antecedent flow would indeed be important predictors for understanding the lake influence that might be occurring on our streamflow regimes. So we plotted our peak flow response and our rise rate against the event precipitation magnitude. And we ordered our sites by increasing distance from the lake outlet. And there's sort of a lot going on here, but you can focus on the differences in slope. They're a bit less obvious here with peak flow response, but sites 13, 9, and 5 have a steeper slope than sites like 6 and 7, so a greater increase in peak flow response for a given increase in event precipitation. And we see similar results with rise rate as well. It's a bit more obvious, although there's some more noise in this relationship. To quantify what we were seeing in the scatter plots, we fit linear regressions for peak flow response and rise rate with our predictor variables, event precipitation and antecedent flow. And these are the coefficient estimates. You can sort of see in here that 5, 9, and 13 tend to plot a bit higher with higher coefficient estimates. So for example, in the intercept here with peak flow response, 9 and 13 have higher coefficient estimates. And another good example would be with the rise rate, where we see in the event precipitation 5, 9, and 13 having a higher coefficient estimate. So again, there's a bit of noise here, especially with these antecedent flow panels. We found that that was a less important predictor than the event precipitation magnitude. So to sort of wrap up what I was sort of going on about there, catchments closer to lake outflows were less responsive to rainfall than catchments further, than further downstream. And this animation highlights this. So this is one streamflow event, and I'll point out, so this dot here is catchment 9, 13 here, and 5. And as you see it play through, these are the sites that increase quickly and have the greatest magnitude. Sites like 6 and 7 have very consistent dots. So the dot size represents the streamflow magnitude at that point in time. And then we also noted that event precipitation was more important than antecedent flow. So overall, as we didn't really talk about the annual analysis, but generally lakes seem to reduce annual flashiness downstream to some extent. And at the event scale, lakes moderated catchment response to rainfall, but this moderation was greatest immediately downstream of the lake. And that makes sense as you consider you're getting more inputs from the hill slope versus from the lake outlet directly. And then we also wanted to highlight that the sub-daily data was very critical for capturing lake influence, as things were a bit less clear at the daily scale than they were at the hourly. So overall, this case study using Turkey Lakes, it's a relatively small scale, but I think these results helped us understand how lakes are influencing this streamflow regime in this type of environment. And we can use this work to inform further analysis of these streamflow interactions. So for example, we could ask questions about how the role of lakes might alter watershed sensitivity to change. And we could explore further modeling work that might look at how lakes could moderate or mitigate or absorb impacts of harvesting down or other disturbances downstream. So as illustrated in this diagram here, if you harvest upstream of a chain of 2 lakes versus harvesting in between 2 lakes, how are the downstream impacts, how do they differ? So those are examples of next steps for this area of research. So we just wanted to quickly thank the current and past field staff at Turkey Lakes for providing us this data, as well as Melanie Taylor for providing sub-daily data from the water survey, and Paul Soto, who initially worked this data out. So that is all from me, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Danielle. So we have one question here that I'll start with, but just before I quickly say that, just a reminder, I have to correct myself. You can click the Q&A button at the base here if you have any additional questions instead of putting it in the chat. So question here is, did you look at the relationship between lake level and flow in the various streams, and is this insightful?
I think that's a great question, and I think we would do that if we had that data, but I don't believe we do have the continuous lake level data for that extended time period. But yeah, that would be really interesting to investigate. Some of the sites that are very close to the lake outflows are probably a fairly good representation of that, but yeah, that's a great question, so thank you.
And I think we have time for another question I have here. Do you think the ratio of lake area to catchment area might help identify the more sensitive watersheds?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And we did include that variable sort of in our analysis. Generally, the distance downstream of the lake was more more predictive of that influence, but the lake area was relative to catchment area was something we did consider as well. I hope that answers that question.
Great. Thank you, Danielle. That's great.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sarah Ariano from Ryerson University. Sarah, when you're ready, you can share your screen and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. So hi, my name is Sarah, and today I'm going to be talking about kind of the second half of my PhD research focused on assessing urban stream water age. So urbanization results in changes to the natural surface cover. We have reductions in vegetation, greater impervious surface cover, and this modifies the pathways that water can take to the stream. So we have reductions in infiltration, greater evapotranspiration, and greater runoff. So traditionally, stormwater management has focused on diverting water from roadways and paved surfaces as quickly as possible. And this is traditionally done through an efficient and rapid conveyance network approach with no end of pipe controls. So because of this traditional approach to stormwater management, this modifies the pathways that water can take to the stream compared to natural catchments. So in urban catchments, stormwater management can result in transporting runoff that's generated inside the catchment outside the catchment, and vice versa. Runoff that's generated outside the catchment can actually be transported inside the catchment. So then when we look at layering on impervious cover in these urban catchments, we can see that metrics of imperviousness that don't necessarily incorporate the sewer network may be missing sort of like a key proponent of impervious cover. So we can look at total impervious area, which reflects the proportion of the catchment that is impervious, compared to the directly connected impervious area, which includes the impervious area that is directly connected to the stream through the network of sewers. So while this flashy hydrologic response is relatively well characterized in urban streams, the relative sources and flow pathways of water through urban landscapes is relatively understudied and not very well understood. So sustainable management of urban water systems, including mitigation of urban flooding, as well as urban water quality issues, will be limited until we can confidently explain where urban stream water is coming from, and then how water quality and water age are related. So this is driving the rationale for our research project, which is driven by the desire to explore the variability of stream water age for urban watersheds to better understand the velocities of water. And this is really important for accurate water quality modeling. So the objective of the study is to investigate the range of water ages for multiple urban catchments. And so the main research questions are, how variable is stream water age across a large mid-latitude city? And then question 2, so what is the influence of the directly connected impervious area, so that metric of imperviousness, compared to more traditional metrics, such as the total impervious area? And then finally, what's the distribution of water age during storm events? And this was done for a subset of urban watersheds. So this study area is located in the Greater Toronto Area, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including Mississauga of the Credit, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee, as well as the Wendat peoples, and is now home to a diverse group of First Nations, Inuit, as well as Métis people. So manual and automated field sampling of 8 watersheds was conducted bi-weekly for stable isotopes of oxygen as well as hydrogen. And then this was used to look at the age distribution of water. And then we also had 3 nearby precipitation collectors where we also collected rainfall bi-weekly. So this is just an overview of our methodology. We conducted a 2-year bi-weekly sampling campaign for precipitation and stream water. And this is coming to a close, so we're not quite finished, but it should be done next month. These samples were analyzed on a Los Gatos liquid water isotope analyzer. And just to preface the rest of this presentation, we only have 1 year of results so far. And so I suspect that our results will change with the additional year of data. And then we've conducted some stream water age computations. So we calculated the mean transit time as well as young water fraction. And then to look at the impervious surface to stream connectivity. And then we've also done some hydrograph separation for a couple of the watersheds. And we've employed a 2 end member mixing model. And then finally, the last step of this project, we'll look at doing some transit time distribution modeling, but that will not be done until we have the full data set. So the results for research question 1, looking at how variable stream water age is across a mid-latitude city, we can see that the 8 Study watersheds have a range of mean transit time estimates, which range from 10 to 200 days. So again, these results are very preliminary, and results from Mimico Creek aren't included in this analysis because we have limited data availability at that site specifically, but we expect to see results similar to Perjuli et al., who saw mean transit time estimates ranging from 63 to about 88 days. So then for our second research question, looking at the directly connected impervious area. So we compared the total impervious area and the directly connected impervious area to our mean transit time estimates. And we can see that generally mean transit time decreases with increasing impervious cover, which is kind of to be expected. However, the relationship is weak and not statistically significant. And then when we compare total impervious area to the directly connected impervious area, we see that the directly connected impervious area doesn't actually help to explain any additional variability. So when we incorporate that, the sewers, this relationship doesn't help to explain the variability anymore. And we see the same thing with the young water fraction. So the young water fraction represents the water in the catchment that's less than a 2 to 3 month age threshold. And we can see sort of an expected relationship where we have with increasing catchment imperviousness, generally younger water in the catchment. And then finally, for our last research question, so what's the distribution of water age for a subset of urban watersheds? We sampled 3 events at each of these watersheds, and I'll just be presenting some of those results today because we're still analyzing some of them. But we looked at Black Creek, Etobicoke Creek, and Mimico Creek, which have varying levels of impervious cover. So preliminary results suggest that storm event samples are often more enriched generally than our baseline sampling. And I'm using the term baseline here because these samples are collected biweekly and they haven't been corrected for flow. So here are the 2 events for Black Creek, and we can see that we have varying levels of rainfall as well as hydrologic response. The points along the hydrograph represent the isotopic composition of deuterium as well as oxygen 18 and the time of sampling. So we have 2 events for this site, and then for the hydrograph separation. So based off our 2 end member mixing model, where pre-event stream flow and precipitation were used as the 2 end members, we can see that the source of water to the stream is predominantly rainfall or new water, but still the sort of distribution of new and old water is a little surprising for a creek so urbanized. And then we sampled 2 vastly different events at Etobicoke Creek. So we have a really large event, 40 millimeters with over 200 cubic meters per second of peak flow. And then another smaller, more traditional reoccurring event. And we can see the results for Etobicoke Creek that for this watershed in particular, just based off these 2 events, that generally old water is dominating the hydrograph. So we still have 1 more event, and we'll see if this trend persists once we complete the analysis. And then the final results here for Mimico Creek, we sampled again 3 events with varying levels of rainfall and hydrologic response, but relatively similar. It's important to note that the first event is a mix of rain and snow kind of sleet mixture. So you can see the isotopic composition is a little different than the event 2 and 3. So like Black Creek, for Mimico Creek, the dominant source of water to the stream is rainfall or new. But again, we still see these large contributions of old water. So preliminary results suggest, kind of as expected, the mean transit time decreases and the young water fraction increases with increasing catchment imperviousness. What we find more surprising, I guess, for these systems that have these, that are largely drained by sewers with traditional stormwater management practices, that we still have a large proportion of the storm flow hydrograph being dominated by old water, so about 38 to 61%. Some previous research has suggested that it can be more new water dominated, upwards of 76 to 78%. But these studies weren't conducted in these sort of heavily urbanized catchments, and sometimes they were smaller study areas. So Ongoing work is looking to better understand the impact of sampling frequency on our understanding of stream water age, as well as mean transit time and transit time distribution. So there's a lot of previous research to suggest that biweekly or weekly sampling is inadequate for correctly characterizing the mean transit time or transit time distribution for these really flashy urban catchments. So right now we're looking at the effectiveness of employing a high resolution sampling campaign at one study watershed and looking at the differences in how we can characterize the mean transit time of the watershed. And this will be done at Black Creek, and it's just started last month. And for another project that we're working on, because of the sort of mixture that we're seeing with the hydrograph separation, so that old water potentially dominated or new water dominated, but pretty 50-50 split, we're looking at sort of quantifying the amount of water and the sources of water that are coming out of sewers. And so we want to know, basically to quantify the exchange of shallow groundwater that's happening with sewer pipes, to be able to understand if old water is being contributed through these sewer pipes that kind of exhibit stream-like characteristics where they have base flow and storm flow. So we can better characterize and understand how sewers are interacting and potentially driving stream flow generation in these heavily urbanized watersheds. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it, and I'll take some questions.
Great, thank you, Sarah. We have a talk here, or a question here from Jason. Great talk, Sarah. Are storm sewer networks well mapped? Does the and the follow up to that is, does the quality of mapping data vary by municipality?
That's a very good question, Jason. Yes, storm sewer networks are mapped. Not across every single municipality, but I believe it's mandated by the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks that municipalities need to have an asset management database. So it's becoming more prominent that municipalities have really well mapped sewer infrastructure data. So most of the data is available in GIS format, but it still is a work in progress. But that definitely is a limitation of this work, the accuracy of the sewer networks.
Great, thank you. We do have another question here. Can you describe where the old water is coming from? Is it groundwater?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it can definitely be groundwater, maybe even some soil water. But when we think of, that's kind of why we're looking at doing this sort of pipe catchment neighborhood level project to kind of understand where the water is being stored. So whether it's being stored in the system, if it's groundwater leaking into the pipes, if it's stored in maybe even stormwater ponds. There's definitely a lot of potential sources of this old water in urban catchments. So hopefully kind of by better understanding old water contributions potentially from storm sewers will help to kind of answer a piece of that puzzle.
Just as a follow-up on that, Sarah, can you actually sample some of those potential sources, or are some completely, I mean, is it difficult in an urban system to maybe capture some of that?
I think it is a little maybe more complex because, so we're looking at sampling tap water because tap water can be a source of stream flow generation. And then you can sample the water coming from the pipes. So that could be most likely groundwater, but it could also be water coming from like sump pumps or foundation drains. So any water that's stored kind of at the neighborhood level, which is a little bit harder to kind of quantify that. But I guess really the hardest part is teasing out what is groundwater in urban catchments, because you potentially have all of these sources. So leaking sewer systems, leaking tap water systems that could be kind of contributing to your groundwater signal. So I think that's probably the most complicated part of trying to find that particular end number.
I'm going to squeeze in a final question here for you, Sarah. Sherry asks, would you expect similar old water contributions in older and newer neighborhoods?
That's a very good question. Ideally, no, but I know that the quality of newer developments is sometimes not as high as some of the older developments. And that's actually a really common problem with groundwater and rainwater infiltrating into the sewer system because the quality is not as good. So you actually can have more broken pipes and more cracks compared to some of the older neighborhoods. So I think it really depends on the age of the development as well as the quality of the development.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.
And my apologies to Sarah and Julia. I switched your order at the last minute, so good on you to jump. So let me introduce our next speaker, Julia Hathaway from the University of Waterloo. And Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Is my screen visible?
Not yet.
Not yet. How about now?
No, I don't think we're seeing it.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, my computer's giving me problems here.
That's okay. Oh, it flickered on. There you go.
There's it going now?
Yep. I think you just want to
Okay.
do a full, play from start and do a full screen and you're good to go.
Okay, is it showing the slides right now?
Yes, we see the intro slide.
Okay, perfect. All right, so hi everyone. My name is Julia and I'm a master's student at the University of Waterloo. Today I will be talking to you about wetland hydrologic functions in cold region mountainous landscapes located specifically in the Eastern Canadian Rocky Mountains. To start, I'll give a brief background to put this research into context. So why do we care about mountain headwater catchments? Well, they're of both high environmental and economic value. They provide fresh water to a large portion of Western Canada and support an abundance of natural ecosystems and biodiversity. In addition, freshwater stores provide communities such as Calgary with water for industry, agriculture, and private use. Unfortunately, these services are threatened by climate change, and as a result, this region is experiencing a number of hydrometeorological changes. Wetland ecosystems are crucial in this fight against climate change in cold regions because of their ability to store water, regulate runoff, and mitigate flooding. However, we know very little about how water moves through these wetlands, where water is sourced from, and the impacts on water distribution. So the objectives of my study are to, one, map the spatial and temporal variability of stable water isotope composition in ground, rain, snow, stream, and surface waters in mountainous wetlands over multiple seasons, and two, to characterize climate controls on stable water isotope composition in wetlands. So the study site is comprised of 29 wetland research sites encompassing an approximate area of 1,900 square kilometers, spread out throughout the Kananaskis Valley near Calgary, Alberta. The sites range in elevations from 1,200 to 1,900 meters above sea level and are categorized as either observation, synoptic, or intensive sites, depending on the intensity of data collection. So in order to study hydrological processes across various scales, I used stable water isotopes of deuterium and delta O18. The sample collection at intensive and synoptic sites occurred during the 2018, 2019, and 2020 growing seasons, where all source waters were sampled. However, the 2020 season was unfortunately cut short due to COVID. Additionally, RH, air temp, and precip were recorded from towers positioned at the 900 and 1200 meters above sea level sites to capture climate trends at both low and high elevations. Surface water samples were collected at observation sites in 2012 as part of a larger database of 500 wetlands to originally assess the hydrologic influence of beaver habitat. I sampled these sites again during the 2020 growing season. So this graph here just is a representation of 30-year averages from the Kananaskis Valley using data from Environment Canada. On average, precipitation increases during the spring months, beginning as snow and tapers off throughout the growing season, correlated with peak temperatures occurring in July through August. In terms of data analysis, I calculated deuterium excess to interpret evaporative signals across the landscape and assess meteorological forcings. So moving on to some results, I separated them into spatial and temporal analysis. Starting with spatial variability of isotopes, the results from synoptic and intensive analysis, where all source waters were sampled, show a normal distribution with depleted snow signals here on the left and enriched rain signals on the right. With depleted meaning less of the heavy isotope delta O18 and enriched meaning more of the heavy isotope delta O18. Values are plotted against the global meteoric waterline and local meteoric waterline, which are regressions describing the average relationship between hydrogen and oxygen isotopes. Here, the local evaporation line is also included to show waters that have undergone evaporation. The majority of values do plot along the local meteoric waterline and evaporation line, indicating non-equilibrium isotope effects or evaporation due to local climate conditions. There is a significant mixing of source waters demonstrated by this clustering pattern here between groundwater, stream, and surface waters, except for a slight deviation of depleted stream water values. When looking at individual sites here, there is a distinct separation of stream samples originating from both high and mid elevation sites during 2018 and 2019, demonstrated here at Sibbald and at Birstall. The depleted stream signals derive from Birstall Wetland, the high elevation site at 1900 meters above sea level, which is at the end of a glacial valley. Perhaps the most surprising find from synoptic and intensive sites is the apparent lack of strong linear depletion in delta O18 values in precipitation, which I hypothesized would occur in this region due to orographic uplift resulting in significantly more depleted values at higher elevations. Instead, there were depleted signals around mid-elevation sites. So looking back at this isoplot, the distribution of precipitation samples seen here cannot be solely explained by an altitude isotope relationship. So looking at temporal data, it does show strong seasonality with O18 values depleted in the winter and spring and enriched values in the summer. Rain showed the strongest seasonal variability, followed by surface water and streams, which is best represented at Sylvester and SA20. Interestingly, stream water showed consistently more depleted O18 signatures than groundwater, shown here at Prairie Creek at the beginning of the growing season, and then transitions, then groundwater at the beginning of the growing season and then transitions to more enriched signals during the post-growing season. This correlates with decreased precipitation and increased temperatures during the late summer and shows that groundwater could take over as the dominant flow source during the later growing season. Surface water samples from observation sites were more widely distributed, as seen by this box plot on the right, and not surprisingly, closely follow the local evaporation line for both 2012 and 2020, instead of meteoric water lines, which is expected for surface water because of exposure to meteorological forcing. D-axis values were well below the global average of 10, indicating evaporative influence at all observation sites. These observation sites did show a stronger altitude isotope relationship, with values clearly becoming more isotopically depleted as altitude increased, with D-axis subsequently increasing. This is an expected result due to rainout events at lower elevations. In addition to stronger altitude isotope relationships, observation sites do follow a seasonal trend of enriched averages during the peak growing season, followed by depleted signals entering the post-growing season. Although these are taken at 2012 and then the 2020 season had to happen later. This trend indicates significant sensitivity to local climates, especially as seasons change quite suddenly around September, with rapidly decreasing temperatures and onset of more snow versus rain precipitation. So moving towards discussion and conclusions, I'll revisit my objectives here, which are to map spatial and temporal variability of source waters throughout multiple seasons and characterize climate controls on water isotope composition. So the main findings from this study are clumped into 3 points. I won't go over all of the points on this screen, but starting number 1, there was not an apparent strong altitude isotope relationship in precipitation from low to high elevations, but instead strong seasonality in precipitation signals. This again indicates the importance of local climate patterns to this region and is an area of future research to decipher site-specific patterns. Number 2, the damped variability in groundwater and streams compared to precipitation indicates mixing with stored water within the landscape. This could indicate longer residence times within individual wetlands and greater storage capacity. The slight enrichment of groundwater near the end of the growing season could indicate that it takes over as the dominant flow source. However, this needs to be further analyzed at individual sites to determine the exact reason for the enrichment, since I only collected surface water samples at these sites. And lastly, surface waters did show a stronger isotope altitude relationship and stronger seasonality as compared to precipitation, indicating longer residence times within ponds and potentially minimal surface connectivity. Again, further research is needed to determine groundwater movements within these within these wetlands, especially within wetlands that do have beaver populations. So to tie this all together, it illustrates the importance of wetlands to store water and regulate runoff, and specifically store meltwater and rain precipitation. And this could become an issue as climate patterns change and snowmelt occurs earlier in the spring season, and we see less rain precipitation during the peak growing seasons, leading to potential water shortages and habitat loss in this region. So that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening. And does anybody have any questions or comments?
Thank you, Julia. We have a question here from Jason. Neat talk, Julia. Could you comment a bit on the distribution and typical sizes of these mountainous wetlands?
Yeah, so they vary a lot in size. Some of them are very large and span over 1 kilometer in length. Some of them are a lot smaller and are only like a couple hundred square kilometers. And sorry, what was the other part of that question?
Oh, just on the distribution and typical sizes of the wetlands.
Yeah, so they are fairly well distributed. The ones that I visited tended to be on the larger side, the valley wetlands, especially up near the high elevation sites, and they decrease actually as I went down the valleys to wetlands that are off the side of the road are typically are a lot smaller, but there is a good distribution of sizes.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to follow with our next speaker is Dan Moore from the University of British Columbia. Dan, feel free to share your screen.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, you're
Perfect.
good.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-author, Rita Winkler, and also to note that I'm giving this presentation from the Kitsilano neighborhood of Vancouver, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders and partners who together have helped to keep the Upper Penticton Creek watershed experiment going for almost 40 years. And I'd like to start by talking about true color as a water quality parameter. True color refers to the color of water if it's been filtered to remove any particulate matter. It primarily reflects the presence of humic and fulvic acids, although iron concentrations can also play a role. Color is not inherently a water quality problem. It does not pose health risks directly, but there's an aesthetic standard that many jurisdictions use of 15 true color units. However, because it may indicate high DOC concentrations, high color values can have implications in relation to water treatment by chlorination and by UV treatment. Further, high water color can promote brownification of lakes, which can influence ecological and biogeochemical processes. The study was conducted at the Upper Penticton Creek Experimental Watersheds. This project began in the 1980s. It focuses on 3 headwater catchments that are gauged by the Water Survey of Canada, including 240 Creek, 241 Creek, 242 Creek. These are located on the interior plateau just east of Okanagan Lake. 240 Creek and 241 Creek drain into Greyback Reservoir, which is the major reservoir for the city of Penticton. 242 Creek drains into Penticton Creek downstream of the reservoir. In the study, 240 Creek is the long-term control, has remained unharvested, whereas 241 and 242 Creek are treatment catchments that have undergone various passes of harvesting. Now that Google Earth image made those catchments look quite flat, so I just wanted to show some oblique photographs of the catchments to emphasize that there is indeed topography there. Now this map shows the 3 catchments along with some characteristics of the catchments. As you can see, 240 and 241 creeks are quite similar in terms of area, elevation range, mean slope, and in the coverage by poorly drained soils. 242 Creek, on the other hand, is a little bit smaller, slightly higher elevations. It has a different aspect in that it faces westerly, whereas the other 2 are south to southeasterly. But the big difference is 40% of the catchment is covered by soils that have been mapped as being poorly drained. This map shows the extent of these soil classes that are imperfect to poorly drained and exhibit glaying. And what I want to emphasize is, interestingly, not only does 242 Creek have a greater extent of these, but they also relate to the harvesting treatments quite differently. As you can see in 241 Creek, where harvesting occurred in several passes from 1992 to 2007, the wet areas or poorly drained soils tend to be located along the stream network, which by and large was covered by riparian buffers. In 242 Creek, most of the harvesting occurred in a shorter period of time and was focused on the lower elevation bands of the catchment, which tended to be where all these poorly drained soils are located. And we'll come back to that when we look at the watercolor results through time. Okay, this plot shows for the pre-harvest periods, the color observations and the stream discharge as recorded at the weirs for the 3 creeks. Now 240 Creek was the control, so the whole period of record was pre-harvest. The water samples were taken roughly weekly to bi-weekly and analyzed in a laboratory for true color. For 241 Creek, unfortunately, sampling started after there'd been 4% harvest, so these aren't true pre-harvest values, and there are only 3 years of data. And similarly for 242 Creek, there were 3 years of data prior to harvest. 240 Creek shows the very typical seasonal pattern of high color values associated with high discharge in the spring snowmelt, followed by a decline through the summer as the water tables drop, and then with some high values during autumn rainstorms. The seasonal pattern does not appear to be as strong at 241 or 242 creeks, though in part this may be due to the smaller number of samples, particularly during the spring freshet for those 2 years, or for those two catchments. Now, to look at the provide hydrological context, we conducted a paired catchment analysis of the stream flow changes. So we split each year into 10-day periods, or each month into 3 10-day periods. For each 10-day period, we fit a pre-harvest regression between the treatment catchment 241 or 242 Creek and the discharges in the control catchment 240 Creek. We then used the pre-harvest regression to predict what the flows in these two catchments would have been for the post-harvest period had harvesting not occurred. In these plots, the red lines represent the observed stream flow or the years that were sampled for color for after or greater than 25% harvest. The black lines represent the predicted, that is, it's an estimate of what the flows would have been had harvesting not occurred. As you can see, both catchments exhibit the typical response of an advanced the snowmelt, so higher flows in the rising limb, a higher peak, and then at least in the early part of the falling limb, lower flows due to the shifting forward of the timing of melt. You can see that the shift in snowmelt to earlier is more marked for 242 Creek, and we believe that this is due to the fact that the harvesting was focused on the lower elevation areas, so it would have enhanced the temporal split between the snowmelt runoff from the lower elevations and the higher elevation bands. These are time series of the watercolor observations. The top right shows 240 Creek, and a few things. One is the solid lines are the medians, and the dashed lines are the 10th and 90th percentiles of the pre-harvest period. And you can see that for 240 Creek, the median was about 17 true color units. 241 and 242 both had higher values for the pre-harvest period. And I would note that the horizontal lines for 241 and 242 Creek are the medians for the pre-harvest period, and the dashed lines are the 10th and 90th percentiles for the pre-harvest period. So 241 and 242 Creek appear to have higher background levels. There's no clear trend through time for 240 Creek, whereas for 241 and 242 Creek, you can see that once the harvest intensity got up to about 20% or 21% for 242 Creek, 28% for 241 Creek, you can see that color values did seem to increase quite dramatically. We conducted a paired catchment analysis of the response to harvesting. So we fit for the pre-harvest periods relations, regression lines between the color in the treatment catchments, 241 and 242, and the corresponding color value in the control catchment, 240. So left-hand plots are for the pre-harvest data. The lines are the pre-harvest regression fits, and the dashed lines are 90% prediction limits. The right-hand plots are for the post-harvest data. Again, we've put the pre-harvest regressions and prediction limits on for reference. And you can see that for 240 Creek, it appears to have been a kind of overall upward shift in the color values that don't seem to relate very strongly to the corresponding values at 240 Creek. Whereas for 242 Creek, there does appear to be an increasing sensitivity. That is for the periods when 240 Creek is higher color, the effect on 242 Creek color was higher. And I would note that the number of observations that fall outside the 90% prediction limits, once the catchment harvest got beyond 20%, was much higher than you'd expect based on the null hypothesis. So those are statistically significant increases. We also looked at the relations between color and discharge. The top right shows the relations for the control catchment 240 Creek. And you see, although there's some scatter, there's a very clear and significant relation between color and the log 10 of discharge. The two left-hand plots show the relation between color and discharge for 241 and 242 Creek. Again, these are regression lines, the solid lines, and 90% prediction limits. The center column shows the post-harvest data again, and you can see that 241 Creek, the color seems to have been an upward shift that seems to be independent of discharge, whereas 242 Creek, the increase in color appears to be very, very strongly sensitive to discharge. That is, the treatment effect appears to be much stronger at higher discharge. So in conclusion, pre-harvest, color was positively related to discharge for all streams, although the relation was stronger for 240 and 242 creeks. Once harvesting reached more than about 20% of the catchment area, there were significant increases in the color values. And this is broadly consistent with work that's been done in Swedish boreal catchment, where they also found that about 20% of the catchment being harvested was a threshold for highly significant increases in DOC they looked at. Interestingly, the increase at 241 Creek appeared to be independent of discharge. This may result, for example, from the fact that there is a floodplain along the main stem of 241 Creek, and that may represent a chronic source of the compounds that create color. The increase at 242 Creek is minimal for the lower discharges, which would be associated with low water tables, and therefore mostly water flowing through the deeper mineral layers of soil, and tend to increase with increasing discharge. And we think this in part relates to the fact that the harvesting was focused on the lower elevations, and that there's a major advance in the timing of snowmelt over those areas that were poorly drained. And so again, just to say that the differing responses appear to be, at least we can hypothesize that are associated with differences in stream riparian morphology, and for 242 Creek, the extent of the poorly drained soils and how that relates to spatial pattern of harvest. And I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I'd like to end by drawing your attention to a data repository that we've recently posted to zenodo.org. We've pulled together as many of the data sets as we could from the almost 40 years of data collection up at Penticton Creek, and they're now publicly available. So if you're interested in accessing these data sets, they include spatial data sets, time series data, climate, soils data, soil moisture, a broad range of variables. Please feel free to access the data through that site. And again, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dan. We have time for some questions. There's a comment or a question here from Jason. Nice talk, Dan. Looked like there was a dog in the stream in your title slide. Any potential impact on watercolor?
That's Rita's dog, and she assures me her dog didn't have any effect on the color.
Sorry, I didn't see that that was a joke until I read it.
Yes.
I did want to ask a question,
Yeah.
Dan. How rare or common is this, time series of watercolor in catchment study or experimental catchments?
No, that's a good question. And this data set just kind of appeared as I was pulling together all the data sets to put them into the repository. And Rita said, "Oh, I've got these data from color that that for a number of years samples were taken and analyzed for color." Unfortunately, DOC or iron weren't monitored, but there were the color data. I've done a review, and I could only find 2 previous studies that looked at the effect of forced harvesting on color. Both of those were on thinning treatments in oak stands in Turkey. So it's something that does not appear, it's a fairly unique data set.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I think we have time for another question, actually. From Tim, how does the TCU units convert into DOC concentrations? 20 to 62 ? Okay,
that's a great question. And I don't really know for sure. What I do know is that there is generally a correlation between color and DOC. but it depends very much on which specific dissolved compounds you have. So there's no kind of universal relation that you could apply.
I think I'll try to squeeze in one more question, Dan, from Masaki. Do you have any guess as to processes that increases DOC at high Q and also at high harvest percent?
Okay, so the work that's come out of the Swedish Boreal, and they've done quite a bit of work looking at DOC response to harvesting. Kind of the first order response is due to the higher water tables, because you can get more water following shallow flow paths where they can pick up more dissolved organic compounds. In Sweden, they've identified soil warming as a secondary cause of the increase. And so we don't really know, because unfortunately we don't have any observations. But one hypothesis for 241 Creek was that the increase was in part due to the higher flows, higher water table levels, but also perhaps due to warming of the soils. But that's just totally a hypothesis. For 242 Creek, I think that what's happening there is that because at 242 Creek, the watercolor response was mainly during the freshet, the main snowmelt period. And I suspect what's happening is that the advance of melt, because the lower elevation bands were harvested, so, and those are the areas of wet soils. So that area started melting off earlier. So you had this, these waters, snowmelt runoff having high DOC concentrations entering the stream way ahead of the runoff from the upper elevation zones, which would have lower water tables. So I think in part it's due to a difference in timing of the runoff between the areas over the wet soils at the lower elevations versus the high areas over better drained soils. But again, those are hypotheses. We'd have to do further analysis and probably go back and do some further data collection to verify those.
Thank you, Dan. We'll follow now with our final speaker for the session, Jason Leach from Natural Resources Canada and Sault Ste. Marie. And Jason, please feel free to take the floor.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I've been blown away by how on time everybody's been. So hopefully I don't screw this up here at the last go. But yeah, as April mentioned, my name is Jason Leach, and I'm a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. And today we're going to try to answer this question: do headwater lakes moderate downstream temperature response to forest harvesting? And before we get going, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors or colleagues on this, Dan Moore, who you've saw present before me, Hjalmar Loudon, who's in Sweden, and then Beth Nielsen and Caleb Guahen at Utah State University. So forest streams provide really critical habitat for a range of aquatic organisms. And a really important part of that habitat is the stream thermal regime, or the water temperature. And there's concerns that through things like climate change, forest harvesting, wildfire, that there are impacts to the stream thermal regimes, that these are in turn having consequences for these aquatic organisms. Particularly of concern is things like cold water fish. So because of these concerns, there's been quite an extensive amount of work done on stream temperature response to forest harvesting over the last 5 decades or so. And if you sort of survey that research, that literature, you tend to find things like this, where summer response to harvesting has ranged anywhere between -2 degrees to 13 degrees post-harvest. And this variability really depends on locations. This could be things like differences in hydrologic processes, in particular sort of groundwater influence, things like that, as well as treatment can be really important. And I'm talking here about the harvesting treatment. So you can expect, or you can imagine, if you have stream side harvesting, so harvesting done right up to the stream edge, you tend to see these sort of higher response values versus situations where we retain let's say a riparian buffer, as you see in this picture here. Tend to be associated with lower responses. So that's sort of capturing the range of variability that we see. One area that we hasn't had a lot of attention is the role of headwater lakes in terms of dictating downstream thermal regimes, but then also how these thermal regimes respond to stream temperature. And as we've seen in a few talks today, especially in Canada and these northern latitudes, there's a lot of lakes out there. There's a lot of small lakes too. And we haven't really tackled what they do and how, if they have any sort of influence at these sort of network scales. One piece of work that has sort of addressed this is some work by Eric Molina, and Dan was part of this team as well, getting on about almost 2 decades old, this study, but it holds up fairly well. They did some sort of standard before-after control impact study to look at the effect of forest harvesting on stream temperature. And their study sites were all located downstream of headwater lakes. So we've got those two, and the shaded is the cut blocks. Two treatment sites, and then a control reference site indicated over there. Hopefully you're seeing my cursor. I know we haven't seen other people's cursors, but anyway, when they conducted this study, what they found was the stream temperature increase didn't get very high compared to what they were expecting or what was reported in the literature at that point. And they speculated that these headwater lakes may have had an important influence on moderating that temperature, as well as things like groundwater impacts or groundwater influence. Because of the study design, they could only really speculate on those processes. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to dig into that and use a modeling environment to sort of explore how and if these sort of lakes can moderate that temperature signal. So we are going to use a virtual experiment. So this is primarily a modeling study, but based on extensive field data. Virtual experiments have been life-saving right here during the COVID time when you can't get out in the field. But the study is based on some work collected at the Crickland Catchment Study. This is located in northern Sweden. And the main focus here was on the C5 to C6 stream reach. This is about 1.5 kilometers long, where we've had extensive field observations made for a while now in terms of stream discharge, above stream microclimate, weather stations, stream temperatures, subsurface temperatures, as well as a pretty good estimate of the lateral inflows or hill slope runoff entering that stream. And the nice thing here is that, or fortunate thing, or opportunistic thing, is that this stream is headed by a small lake. And so we can start to explore some of this stuff. In this study, we also used some data collected at the C1 catchment that's located very close to the C5, C6 study reach. And the C1 catchment is almost entirely forested, doesn't contain a lake. And so, and another great aspect of this thing is that the catchment area of the C1 catchment is fairly close to the size of the C5 catchment area. So what we're able to do, or what we take advantage of, is we sort of unplug this C5 catchment and stick the C1 catchment on top, and voila, there you have your virtual experiment where you're contrasting that downstream impact, whether you've got a lake or no lake. So that's exactly what we did, and here's a sort of visualization showing our two quasi-virtual catchments, one a bit more virtual than the other. On the left, we have our headwater system, and then our headwater lake system, and then on our right is the no lake system. And so what we did was simulate harvesting along the study reach, and we're able to explore the stream temperature response and dynamics, whether you have a lake or no lake heading your stream. To do this, we use a process-based stream temperature model. This is a model developed by Beth and Caleb at Utah State University. It's called Hydrocouple. The nice thing about it is that we can explicitly account for the role of riparian vegetation. The way we did that was use hemispherical images captured along the stream reach. So it was about 110 images captured. The nice thing about this is that we can digitize and quantify the riparian vegetation, but we can also manipulate these images by essentially removing the riparian vegetation, but leaving the terrain vegetation, or sorry, the terrain shading in place. And so that way we can, this somewhat effective way at sort of simulating forest harvesting and the impacts on the net radiation exchange. I won't get into it here, but we've comprehensively evaluated this model for the test catchment, and that came out very recently in a publication this year. So a few assumptions before we start to get into the virtual experiment. One is that we're assuming that the current model captures the key energy exchange processes, and we fairly certain, or we're quite confident that's occurring. Well, again, because we did an extensive sort of evaluation, looking at a lot of the internal processes, and it seems to do a fairly good job. In terms of stream side harvesting, we're assuming some responses. One, we're assuming that incoming solar radiation, daytime air temperature, and wind speed increase, and that nighttime air temperature and relative humidity decrease following forest harvesting. I think these are relatively reasonable assumptions to make, particularly when you look at the empirical work that looks at riparian and above-stream microclimate response to forest harvesting. Another important assumption to note is that we're assuming that the vegetation understory or regrowth provides really minimal shade. This is important because we're assuming streamside harvesting, but often in an operational setting, non-commercial trees or shrub layers are left on site, and these can provide a decent amount of shade. So we're just recognizing this as a limitation in this study. We'll get into some of the data here. This is actual data. We'll get into the modeled output a little bit later. But what this is highlighting the study period here from July to October. And what we have in red is the no lake data, and in blue is the lake data. And the top graph here shows the upper boundary stream flow. And there's two key things to draw from this. One is that obviously the lake helps attenuate peak flow responses, but it also helps to sustain base flow levels compared to the no lake scenario. And similarly, we see quite a distinct difference between the lake and no lake site in terms of the upper boundary stream temperature. So as you see during the study period, during the summer into early fall summer period, study period, the lake has persistently warmer temperatures discharging into the stream than the no lake site. And that makes sense. This, although it's a relatively small lake, it acts like a solar panel. It's a lot of solar loading. That water is warmed and then moves downstream. Now we can simulate harvesting on these two lake and no lake scenarios. And that's what we're showing here. And this is the downstream temperature, hourly downstream temperature response or prediction. In black is the unharvested, in red is the streamside harvesting. There's a couple of things to take away from this. One is that we see an increase in downstream temperature following for streamside harvesting, not that surprising. But the magnitude seems to range anywhere between sort of, at a daily time step, anywhere between sort of 1 or 2 degrees up to about 8 or 9 degrees Celsius. So falling somewhat into the range that we see in the literature in terms of stream temperature response, particularly for streamside harvesting. The other thing, if you squint really carefully, you might be able to tell that the no lake site responded a little bit more than the lake site, but I've got another graph that's going to show that a little bit clearer. So this, I'm going to talk about these graphs a little bit. It involves a little bit of mental gymnastics to sort of sort this out, but hopefully I can sort of explain it to you in a little bit to help you with this. And so what the top graph shows is the relative change in stream temperature for the lake site subtracted from the relative change or stream temperature response for the no lake site. The important thing here is if this solid line plots above the dotted line, then the no lake response to harvesting is greater. If the line plots below the dotted line, the lake response to harvesting is greater. So what you see is that for most of the study period, that the no lake response hovers between 0.5 and 1.5 degrees greater response than the lake site. Although this is punctuated at times by these periods where the lake site actually response is greater. The bottom graph here helps put that in context. This is the difference in discharge between the no lake and lake site. And what you see here is that difference, those periods where the lake response is greater, occurs when we have high runoff events. That is when the no lake flow is greater than the lake flow. So what we gather from this graph, or these paragraphs, is really the dominant influence of hydrology controlling that stream temperature response. We can look under the hood of the model a little bit more and start to look at some of the individual energy exchange processes also contributing to this difference in stream temperature response to harvesting. This is a little diagram here just outlining the various energy exchange processes acting on a stream. So you have your long wave radiation, your solar radiation, your sensible latent heat flux, your bed heat conduction, and then a various number of advective fluxes like hyperthermic exchange and lateral advection. So this graph's a little bit busy, but again, I'll hopefully walk you through this. What this shows is the individual flux estimates for the post-harvest period or the post-harvest scenario for the lake and no lake sites, lake being in blue, no lake in red. A couple things to note is that a couple of the fluxes, there's no real big difference between the lake and the lake scenario. So bed conduction, hyporheic exchange, they have very strong diurnal patterns. But in terms of whether the lake or no lake has an influence, there is very little. The friction flux, obviously there's a difference here, but the magnitude of that flux is really minimal, so it's not having a huge influence. Now, I want to focus in on three other fluxes, the latent heat flux, the sensible, and outgoing long-wave radiation. And here we see that the lake site typically has persistent, more negative flux for each of these, flux magnitude for each of these energy exchange processes. So what does that mean? That means there's more energy leaving the stream environment or outgoing energy. And in particular, in terms of outgoing long wave radiation, that makes up a decent chunk. So what does that mean? Well, that is a function of the warmer temperatures in the lake system. These are all influenced by temperature, and with a warmer lake, warmer temperature in those stream environments, there's a greater gradient of energy moving away from the stream. So in conclusion, we see that this virtual experiment seems to support some of the findings by that Molina paper, that lakes do appear to moderate downstream temperature response. And it's really the fact that the lakes store and delay runoff from rain events. They augment base flow, and they have these elevated outflow temperatures. These are really the key drivers for that moderating response. And I think sort of a broader sort of take-home message, and maybe it's something that's echoed in a few of these talks today, is that these small and medium-sized lakes seem to be really important, and we often sort of ignore them, but they may be critical for sort of understanding extreme resilience to environmental change. And with that, I thank you very much for your time, and yeah, there we go. And thanks for sticking around.
Thanks so much, Jason. Do we have time for a short question? We have one here. From Masaki. Nice talk, Jason. I noticed that hyporheic exchange has a high magnitude in comparison to other fluxes. Do you think that is real?
Yeah, that's a great question. In short, this gets into sort of the other work of sort of evaluating the site at the site evaluation, and that was the one term that we had the most trouble sort of nailing down. And as you're probably aware, it's a challenging one. We did some sensitivity analysis to see, you know, if there's any other sort of process that could account for what that hyporheic term was doing to the stream temperature, and it was really difficult. It was really difficult to have that sort of diurnal influence attributed to anything else. So yeah, it's uncertain. I think the more we look into these systems, the more we see hyporheic exchange being a really critical influence on a lot of these processes, particularly in that sort of stream environment where there's a lot of sort of sand, cobbles, a lot of sort of peat material in the stream bed. So I think there's a possibility for a lot of exchange. So so yeah, it's still a bit of an open question for sure.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason.
Okay.
And so that's the final talk of this first kickoff session. I want to thank all 6 of our speakers for kicking off this summer session, for the audience and the participants for your attendance, as well as our co-conveners. I want to direct your attention to the upcoming CGU and hydrology sessions, in particular, the next session on Tuesday, the 15th of June, being run by the Solid Earth section on seismology and seismic imaging. And then on the Thursday, so that's the Tuesday, on the Thursday, the 17th of June is our next hydrology session on eco-hydrology, and the list of speakers will be added to the CGU website shortly. So thank you all again. I'm gonna end off here by playing that promotional video for next year's meeting in Saskatoon, and we hope to see you all there. I'll do my share screen. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.